Every year, USA, China, India, Vietnam, and Mongolia, they are reporting these cases. 7 reports of plague, and apparently a lot of these cases, they're most of times in California and Southwest. Welcome, guys, to another episode of my podcast. That's fine with me. Today, we're going to be talking about something interesting, in my opinion. It's going to be plague. Okay, let's talk about plague. The reasons, the causes, all of it in one podcast. Okay, I'm going to get started with the whole thing, what plague is actually about. It is a bacteria, and basically this bacteria was spreaded within like Middle Ages and maybe even earlier. We're going to talk about this a little bit later in today's podcast. And it was spreaded by fleas that were transferred on rats. And not only rats, a lot of different other animals like cats and dogs. Of course, lots of them have fleas, but I guess Middle Ages, they had to face a problem of rats getting everywhere and stealing some food, and they were literally accompanying people through ages. That was the main reason why it was so severe in the Middle Ages, that fleas were everywhere, rats were everywhere, and of course, diseases and dirt and, all of it was everywhere. So what really happened? Who discovered this bacteria? In 1894, Alexander Yersin, he, through a microscope, discovered a bacteria that was causing this plague infection. The name of this bacteria is going to be Yersinia pestis. So a lot of people say, like, why pestis, and this basically describes the name of the bacteria, and that is in charge of plague. And of course, this bacteria is disable the immune system. It's fighting against the defensive cells, and eventually when it kills those cells, it's spreading through the whole entire body and kills a person, or like not even a person, maybe someone else suffered from this plague. I don't know about animals, because there's certain cases when something that is fatal for a human might not be that fatal for an animal. And the great example is AIDS, I guess. It's not harmful for monkeys, but it's pretty much harmful for people. And that is the main idea behind plague. That is a bacteria that is ruining the immune system, and it's eventually killing people. It is really interesting to mention that a lot of people, and me, like myself, I always thought that fleas are not biting people. Fleas are harmless for people. Lice, they live in people's hair and they actually bite people. But about like fleas, I didn't even know that it was possible for fleas to bite people. At least I thought that was the case. Well, a couple of years ago, my cat was itching all the time. She was scratching, and that like really disturbed her, and she couldn't sleep. She was constantly itching, and we're like, maybe it's some sort of like nervous breakdown or something like that, and went to see a doctor. And the doctor said, by the way, my cat has no hair, so she's like naked, basically. That was the main reason why we didn't even think of fleas. And when we came, she said that, well, fleas, they actually bit my husband, and the doctor pointed this out, that he had those big marks. We thought those were some sort of mosquitoes, not exactly mosquitoes, yeah. And then my cat had the same marks. Frankly speaking, I was super lucky that I didn't get this from them or something like this. We were sleeping together, but still I had no marks or no bites. And she said that someone brought this on their shoes, and maybe the reason is that my cat is walking like outside, like she's an outdoor cat sometimes during summer, and that is the main reason why she could have brought some kind of like small flea, and then it spread it in the room, and then we had to clean the whole room entirely. Like we needed to sanitize the whole room. Of course we cleaned the room, and that wasn't the case, but we literally needed to spritz the soap with water, mixed it together, and then just leave the room for the whole day as a quarantine. And that was really weird, honestly. That's why I can actually relate when people didn't really care about tidy rooms. They didn't really care about like animals around. They, frankly speaking, had no idea what caused the plague. There are differences between plagues. The first plague is the bubonic plague. Bubonic plague is something that you probably all know. It's called like Black Death, when you have, not you, but like infected person has swollen lymph nodes, and then it's basically spreading around his groin, armpits, and his neck. Later, the lymph nodes, they're turning black, and then they're changing basically color, and it's fatal. Most of the time, it's fatal, and people die within maybe a couple of days, a week. It's really, really quick. It's spreading super, super quick. Then the second one is pneumonic plague. Pneumonic plague is super contagious. It is related probably in some ways to coronavirus, in some ways, I guess, because when you cough, you can spread the pneumonic plague, you can spread this bacteria, and that is the main reason why it's so contagious. And the third type of plague, it's a little bit of both, I believe, because if the plague, bubonic plague or pneumonic plagues are not treated, then they later, let's say, transform in septicemic plague. Septicemic plague is basically something that is happening to the blood, and then the blood infected, and it's super fatal. 100% cases end up with fatal results. And that's why I was like, I know about bubonic plague, and I thought that during Middle Ages, bubonic plague was the case, but it turned out bubonic plague mixed with pneumonic plague, they resulted to the septicemic plague. So the 3 cases were found during Middle Ages. I have no idea how they were found. I guess through the teeth of their victims, sorta. And I guess it's really interesting to note that during Middle Ages, this wasn't the first time plague happened. And in 542 AD, the first spread of plague happened in Constantinople. And this is let's say nowadays it is Istanbul, Turkey. Every single day, 10,000 people died from the plague, and it subsided only by the 700s. So people were suffering 158 years, I believe, and that's during this time, 100 million people died from this plague, and it was called the Plague of Justinian. The Justinian was some sort of emperor back then, and that's why this plague happened during his ruling. And then the second wave happened actually in the Middle Ages, something that we know right now, and it's one of the most famous because it was the longest period of people's sufferings. And it started in China. Of course, trade was super popular in the Middle Ages. That is the main reason why through Silk Roads it was delivered to Sicilian ports, and then it spread widely through Europe. And during this time, and we're talking about probably like 1334, it was found in China, and then when it spread to Europe, it was maybe like 1340s. Unfortunately, a third of the continent died of the plague. And that was on and off. I believe like plague was on and off from the 14th to 17th, maybe 18th century. And then later, the third wave occurred again in China. And it happened in 1860s and was killing people up to 1959, almost 100 years. And approximately 10 million people died out of it. And right in between of this problem and pandemic situation, some ships from China, they were traveling to North America, and then that is the main reason why they infected half of America with the plague, because of, I guess, rats, and because of some people that were traveling from China to United States. And that is the main reason why a lot of people died during this period of time as well. Though the plague, not even plague, but bacteria was discovered in 1894, unfortunately, it didn't lead to the point where they could cure plague, or maybe it was a little bit hard because antibiotics wasn't that strong back then. And I don't really know if they had antibiotics back in the day. And it's so interesting to know that between 2004 and 2014, the Democratic Republic of the Congo reported that they had severe number of cases, like, infected by plague. And they called like 4,630 people had cases of this disease, and at least 349 actually died. And every year, USA, China, India, Vietnam, and Mongolia, they are reporting these cases. And I guess if I'm not mistaken, each year United States has at least 7 reports of plague, and apparently a lot of these cases out of 7, so it's not a lot, but still out of 7 people, they're most of times in California and Southwest. That is it for statistics, I believe. And of course, this is super, super scary topic to discuss, and I know a lot of you guys will not probably share my fascination from plague. I understand. I totally get it. A lot of people, died, and I'm not fascinated by the fact that there was a death, but I'm fascinated by the results of this plague and how it affected our world and how the world has changed dramatically up until today. In fact, plague, I guess, affected socioeconomic part of life. And how did it start? Okay, a lot of the times, the king back in the day owned the whole land, and of course he could divide this land between the nobles, and then those nobles would divide this, not even divide, but they will take some money from their lords, and lords would use the serfs or peasants to work for them. And mainly it was some sort of slavery mode in the 14th century, and people were not get paid back in the day. And that is the main reason why people suffered. And when plague started, a lot of people died. And of course, no one could find a lot of people to provide for country, for the king. That is the main reason. Even like a lot of people suffered, not only peasants, because peasants, they went to church, they talked to church, and church then talked to nobles, and then nobles talked to the king. That's why every single one from the chain, they suffered from the plague. They actually died from the plague. It is worth to mention that before plague, I guess Europe was overcrowded and it had a lot of people. That was the main reason why slavery was thriving, because a lot of peasants, they needed food for their families, they needed something to provide for, and that was basically feudal country that was divided between nobles, kings, lords, and whatsoever, and people had to suffer. And when plague took a lot of people and there were not a lot of people left to work, peasants and serfs, they started negotiating, because they said, like, you don't really have a lot of people to work for you, but you need to pay us to make sure that we will come. And lords, they had to follow the tendency, because they were, suffering because they couldn't pay the nobles, and nobles, they couldn't pay to the king. And that was the main reason why they had to readjust some of the rules. And that's why peasants, they could actually afford buying stuff, they could afford to dress nicely. And that was the thriving age of extremely extravagant, I guess, dresses for Allied, because Allied, they wanted to distinct themselves from the peasants, because peasants, they had money to purchase nice stuff, and Allied wanted to be better than peasants. That's why they needed something extravagant to show up on some balls and whatever. And that was the main reason why a lot of this, Allied and kings and nobles, they weren't satisfied with the tendency. And later, when the plague wasn't that severe, they tried to take charge later on, but still it was inevitable, and they had to move on with a new pace of life. If we're talking about medical knowledge and some practices, they had evolved as well back in the day, because the sources a lot of doctors were reciting and following, they were from Galen, Hippocrates, and Aristotle, like ages ago, before the plague started. That was the main reason why they had to take some notes and see what worked during their healing process. They needed to take some notes of what was working, what wasn't working. They had to observe, and they had to see what they could do. And that actually caused a lot of breakthroughs when doctors started not only learning from the past, but, creating some sort of science, I believe. In some ways, creating some sort of science. Then we're going to be talking about religion, and if you're interested, I have a little bit different podcast where I talked about witchcraft and religion itself. Of course, religion suffered, church suffered. And the main idea behind church was that if you was super sinful, if you didn't believe in God, then you would die. But unfortunately, a lot of people died. A lot of people of belief and religion, and some church, I guess, representatives died themselves. So the belief was shifted and to the core, and people did not believe church anymore. And there were a lot of groups following around some villages and telling some stories that maybe God is not in everything and everywhere, and you should doubt the words of church. And that was the main reason why plague affected a lot of areas, because people weren't that easy to trust and easy to believe in something that nobles, God, church said, because they were left alone in the trouble and the fear. And of course, there were certain persecutions and migration because of the witchcraft. It's not only with the witchcraft. People, they tried to accuse everyone in their troubles, and they didn't really care if it was reasonable or not. That was the main reason why persecution started, migration started. People were trying to leave some of the villages. And of course, a lot of villages literally died. They had no people. Maybe 2 or 3 people were left out in the village. And of course, they couldn't live by themselves, only 2 people. That's why people from different villages, they had to combine their forces, and they had to maybe create a new village, or they had to migrate in order to survive. That was the main reason why it was really popular to migrate from one place to another during Middle Ages, because people needed some support. And especially, it's interesting to say, a lot of the times during the feudal times, family business was important. And of course, someone was baking bread, someone was, in charge of, iron, whatever. And with the plague, a lot of those families died. And the only person left, he had to teach someone, but he had no one to teach. That was the main reason why he had to hire someone from a little bit different family who had no, money, or who had no business, I believe. So he had to hire in order to leave and to sell and maybe just, create something different. That's why it really helped to establish a business like model we have now when we hire people and pay them money, instead of just having a family business, which is still popular, but it's not as popular as just a regular business where you kind of hire people. And that was because of plague. That was the reason of plague, because like later before that, a family had at least like 15 kids, and that's why they worked together as a family business. And later when they were left with 1 or 2 kids, that had to change. And one of the most interesting facts, women rights. Yeah, that is so interesting. Before plague, women were literally like a dirt. People did not consider women as a human being. They had no rights. They had nothing. They were sold to marry whatever like Lord wanted them to marry. They were sold as slaves. And when men started dying during plague, of course, a lot of families were left with only women, or a lot of villages, they were left with women only, and they had to take action. They had to do something in order to provide. And that's why they gained more power and they gained some rights. And that is the main reason why women were allowed to have their own lands. They were allowed to have their own business. They were allowed to spend money and to provide for the family, because the father died, or maybe some man died in their family and she was left alone. Of course, later on, church and ally wanted to take off this power back. And they did a little bit, but still, it was really hard to stop the progress. And of course, a lot of these women, they had become pretty powerful. And it was really hard to take off this power from them in the future. So yeah, church in the Middle Ages was not about faith. It was mainly about power. And sometimes I feel like church is about power nowadays. But I'm not judging. I'm not saying that it's bad or not bad. And I'm like not talking to people in a way like you shouldn't believe in God. It's your business. I don't care. I'm just seeing this from a perspective of like something that happened in history and something that people had to deal with. And of course, last but not least area, I guess, that was shifted from plague was art and architecture. So art was really important because we had no TVs, we had nothing. I mean, art was important in human beings' lives, especially higher society and allied. And that was the main reason why a lot of artists, they couldn't, close their eyes and forget about all the suffers that people are facing in the life. That was the main reason why it was super dramatic. It was related to death. People showed death. People were talking about demons. People were talking about, like hell. And they were showing this through their art, and they were showing this through some plays. That's why this time was quite dramatic, because it was affected by certain actions and certain, let's say, events that happened in the Middle Ages. And architecture suffered. Gothic, architecture had a rise back then. And that is the main reason why I feel plague was a necessity in some ways. And when I read a couple of articles, that is so hard to say, but every war and every pandemic situation is a huge progress for the whole humanity. It sounds crazy. It sounds really cruel. But unfortunately, whenever people face certain pandemic situation as coronavirus, let's just have this as an example, people were forced to stay home. And that actually caused a lot of situations when people, after they were back from the lockdown, they didn't really want to go back to work. And they were considering staying home and working from home, because they could do this during lockdown. Why couldn't they carry on with the same tendency? And a lot of my generation people, like from my circle, they're literally complaining. They're saying like, I want to work from home. I'm super tired, wasting at least 2 or 3 hours to get to work. And that worked probably for boomers and maybe work for the generation Y, from a second Y. But it doesn't work for generation Z. Z. And then it doesn't really work for millennials. It doesn't really work for alpha. A lot of us are interested in working from home. So that was the main reason what shifted the society when coronavirus lockdown was over. And that is it for today, guys. I hope this all over the place speech was at least a little bit reasonable, but I love the changes that happened with the economic area field, with medicine, with religious, with migration and women's rights and art itself. I guess this is fascinating. It is fascinating how one small bacteria can change the whole entire world and influence this and influence us up until nowadays. We see a lot of this result from Middle Ages, from pandemic situation, echoing now with business models, with art, to be creative, to be a little bit more free, women's rights, and people are demanding to listen to their voices, and in some ways, breaking down through this allied and just like giving opportunities for people to earn money, not to be slaves. That's cool, guys. That is so cool from this perspective. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. I love you all so much, and I'm gonna see you in my next one. Love you all. Don't forget that you can ask me any questions or share your stories. Down in the description box, I have my mail, and it's going to be 100% anonymous if you share your stories. Till next time, bye-bye.